class and you want to do research assistant work for an economist in the future, let me know and I can arrange that.
I'm thinking, I was talking about last night. Ordering Chinese.
So today we are entering sort of the final stretch of the course. So far we did perfectly competitive models, then we did monopoly models. Today we're going to do models where there are more than one, but still a small number of firms. So that will be a bridge between monopoly and competition. And the basic problem is, the monopolist has an optimal thing to do. Competition, everyone takes prices as given, so everyone has an optimal thing to do. But there's lots of different ways one can think about how people interact oligopolistically or strategically. And that's what makes oligopolistic interactions a bit more complicated than either monopoly or competition. So today we're going to look at a range of different ways of thinking about oligopoly. So we'll start with sort of the most classical model, which is Cournot's model of quantity choice. We'll then look at the so-called Bertrand Edgeworth critique of the Cournot quantity choice model, and we'll talk about both the paradox of two firms and then heterogeneity of various sorts as solutions to this problem. We'll then talk about collusion and the incentives that firms have to collude, how it can be difficult to collude in situations where collusion will be easier. We'll then talk about conjectural variations models as ways of nesting collusion into a model of competition, and we'll talk about how to empirically measure conjectures. Okay, so let's start with the most classic model of oligopoly, the Cournot model. So Steve, can you tell me what goes on in the Cournot model? What's the basic idea? Don't read off the slides.
Not sure. I didn't get a chance to get to that reading.
Okay. Anybody else want to describe the Cournot model? Yeah, Mike.
The first firm takes the quantity to sell, and the next firm follows.
No, that's the Stackelberg model. Who else wants to describe the Cournot model? Okay, nobody else. Okay, so there are n firms, and they produce a homogeneous product. That is, they're all producing the same thing. And we'll often assume, including during most of the class today, that they have a constant marginal cost C. And each firm is going to take as given the quantity produced by other firms. So they're going to choose the optimal quantity to produce or the optimal price to set, taking as given the quantity produced by the other firms. So this is quite similar to the sort of competition that we talked about in Lecture 9, remember? In Lecture 9 I talked about the possibility that someone else would come in and produce a bit of the good that you're producing, right? And sometimes this is referred to as firms choosing quantities, but this is a little bit misleading. It's really that firms take as given the quantities of other firms. And we'll talk about this more in a bit. So equilibrium is then when each firm maximizes its profits given the quantities produced by the other firms. And they sort of all do that at the same time. That's an equilibrium. So each firm is going to earn profits, which is the quantity they sell, times the price, which depends on the quantity they sell, QI, and the quantity sold by all the other firms. Capital Q sub negative I. Negative I indicates everyone except for firm I. Times minus the cost. And Emily? Hey! Let me give you a moment to collect yourself. But then, so we're talking about the Cournot model. And this is the firm's profits, the amount that they produce, QI, times the price, which depends on their quantity, and the sum of everybody else's quantities. Can you tell me what the marginal revenue is in this case?
Marginal revenue would be the price takers?
No, they're taking as given the quantities of all the other firms.
Taking this given the quantities. So it would be
So his revenue is QI times P, right? So what happens if you take the derivative of that with respect to QI?
QI. Oh, it's P of QI.
Yeah.
That is QI P prime.
Yeah.
Of just QI, I guess. Because
Well, if QI plus
QI
Q,
plus
yeah.
QI. Minus QI, or no, minus C. Plus QI prime plus PQI plus PQI.
Yeah, it's P plus P prime times QI, right? So, yeah, so it's just this here. And capital Q here is the total quantity that everyone's producing, including me. So marginal revenue, the key point here is that marginal revenue is going to be closer to demand than with monopoly. Why? Because QI is smaller than Q. If there are other people producing, right, then the amount that I care about my inframarginal units that I'm producing is less than the amount that the industry as a whole cares about, raising the price. So this means that the markup's going to reduce. And in particular, imagine that all the firms produce the same amount. They're all the same. So then QI is equal to capital Q over N, which is going to now give us a new version of Lerner's rule. David, what's that going to be? What's Lerner's rule going to become here? The elasticity pricing rule. Remember how we got Lerner's rule? We got it by transforming this P prime thing, right? And now that whole term is going to be divided by N. So what is that going to do to Lerner's rule? Okay. Well, it's going to give us that the markup over price is equal to, it used to be equal to 1 over the elasticity, right? And we derived that from this P prime term, right? If that's now divided by 1 over N, then we just divide this term that includes that by 1 over N, and we get the exact same result, right? So the markup is going to be equal to 1 over N times the elasticity rather than 1 over the elasticity. So as the number of firms gets large, the markup is going to get small, and that is going to be something we'll focus on. Okay, so notice a few things. First of all, even when there are lots of firms, even if we had 10 firms, there would still be a significant markup. Now, it would be like as if there was 10 times the elasticity, but it still wouldn't be infinite, right? So we'll explore on Tuesday the fact that this gradually is going to go to 0, is gradually going to go to infinity as n gets large. That's not going to be the focus today. Our focus today is going to be on how the oligopoly works, and then on Tuesday we'll talk about what happens to the oligopoly as there are more firms. Second, notice that the prices are in between those of a monopoly and perfect competition, right? Perfect competition would be if this is infinity. Monopoly would be if this is 1 over the elasticity, and this is going to be somewhere in between those two, right? And one of the most interesting results coming out of the Cournot model arises only when firms are asymmetric, which we're not going to go through and mathematically solve today. We will actually. Okay. So it comes when firms are asymmetric. So imagine that different firms have different costs CI, right? So then each firm is going to set their marginal revenue equal to their individual marginal cost, right? And that means that lower cost firms have to be producing more, right? Because in order to have to set their marginal revenue equal to a lower marginal cost, because they all have the same marginal revenue function, right? They have to be producing more, right? But them producing more is going to mean that they're charging a higher markup, right? But the problem is that the high-cost firms are still going to be producing some, right? Unless their cost is so high that that they go above the top of the marginal revenue curve, they're still going to be producing some, right? And that's really inefficient, right? Because ideally, all of the goods should be produced by the low-cost firm, right? It's wasteful for some of them to be produced by the high-cost firm. So what that shows is that under monopoly, a firm would always choose to minimize costs, right? Because that's how it maximizes profits. Under competition, we know that everything is efficient, so everything is produced in the most efficient way. But under oligopoly, it can often be the case that there's what's called productive inefficiency. Even given what's produced in the market, it's not produced in the most efficient way. And we can now add this equation up across all the firms in the industry, just sum over I, and we get that Q times P prime of Q plus N times P of Q is equal to the sum of all the firm's costs. Another way we can say that the average cost is if we divide this by N, and then we get that the average quantity times P prime plus P is equal to the average cost. And so what this says is that if any of the firm's cost increases, that leads to 1 over n of the pass-through that would happen for a monopolist. And the reason is that if one firm's cost increases, that increases the average cost by 1 over n times that, right? Because there are n firms. So the point here, which is going to be crucial, is that it's only the average cost that matters, right? This industry acts as if we're sort of like a monopolist, or monopolist with a little bit higher elasticity, that just had the average cost of the firm. So the heterogeneity among firms, the fact that some firms are more efficient than others, doesn't end up mattering all that much for the prediction of the model, right? It only cares about the average cost. And in some sense, this makes the model much more robust to heterogeneity among firms than the other models we're going to look at in a minute, and that'll be a key point of contrast that we're going to make. Okay, so let's take a step back and ask what was the process that we went through to solve this model, right? So we said that the firms took as given some action taken by the other firms, right? Why would they do that? Well, that was just the assumption we made. And more generically, in economics, we call something a strategy if I take as given your choice of that thing. So I treat your quantity as your strategy if I take as given the quantity that you choose. And we assume that each firm optimized given the fact that it took this as given. So this is more generally called a Nash Equilibrium. So when we talk about Nash Equilibrium, that means that everyone optimizes taking as given the strategy, whatever that is, of other firms. So this seems sort of like a relatively simple and reasonable notion of equilibrium, but the devil is all in the details of what we take as given, right? Because we assume that firms believe that other firms' quantities stayed fixed. But why should it be their quantity that stays fixed? Why couldn't it be their price or their markup or anything else, right? And this is the basic problem that arises in any strategic model you think of. Anytime there's a small number of people, not one who's optimizing, not a big market, but a small number of people, everything is going to depend on what each person takes as given that the other person does. And oligopoly is just one example of this problem. So we'll focus on oligopoly because it's one of the most important ones, but this shows up in many contexts. Anytime you hear people talking about game theory, these are the problems that they're worried about. Okay, so let's briefly consider the most common other strategy that economists consider. So Fed, what would happen if the firms in that model were to have taken the other firms' prices as given rather than their quantities?
firm lower their price.
So go on, yeah.
Well then, so if you take everybody's prices given, you could undercut them.
By just a little bit, right? So what would be an equilibrium? Imagine there's two firms that have a cost C. What would be an equilibrium between them?
Well, I don't know in terms of C, but the one who has the lower price, a little bit price will get all of the.
Well, that's right, but then wouldn't the other person go just a little bit below him to get all of it?
That's true. So,
And the other person would go a little bit?
yeah, so they'd get to C.
Yeah, so the only equilibrium is that the price is exactly equal to the cost. Yeah, Edward.
Is there really price discrimination happening in this whole process? Like,
No,
I was like,
we're assuming that people have a uniform price during this
Okay.
process. Competition with price discrimination is an extremely interesting topic, and if you're interested in it, you should look at the, I've been working on that. So the product design lecture, the paper, the Vega-Weil paper is all about that. So, yeah, David.
Why would both firms operate at C and make no profits when they could just operate at the same price and make like half of whatever profits they make?
Because if they undercut the guy by a tiny, tiny bit, they get 100% of the profit.
Yeah, but they know that the other guy's going to do the exact same thing and drive it.
Well, that's a good point. So you're thinking
if
if
they could look like that.
well, so when you're pointing out exactly what the problem with game theory is, right? Which is that it assumes that everyone takes as given whatever the other firm's strategy is, and that seems a bit silly, right? As a way to think about things. So that's exactly what the lecture is going to be all about. But you know, we're sticking with the model right now, and then we're going to critique the model in a moment. But yes, that's absolutely right. You know, if the firm is sort of looking ahead to what other firms are going to do, you know, it might not just undercut. Okay, so positive markups can never be in equilibrium. Everyone undercuts as long as there's more than one firm. Price is equal to cost. This is called the Bertrand Edgeworth paradox, or critique of the Cournot model. It's thought to be a paradox because it seems really weird that a firm with an industry with just two firms would be perfectly competitive like this, right? And I think this is absurd, as I hope you do. And we're going to talk about some potential resolutions for this. So one is that firms differ in their costs, and they may not know the costs of other firms. Another one is that the products produced by the firms may not be exactly the same, either because they're sort of inherently different, or because consumers have trouble finding the other products. So like you're browsing on eBay, it may be offered for a lower price somewhere else, but it would be a pain in the butt to go look for it. Anyone who came to John Levin's talk heard a lot of conversation about those types of issues. Or because of what David was talking about, firms may not take as given the prices of other firms, right? And basically the rest of the lecture is going to be about how we resolve this paradox by thinking about these types of issues, right? These are three pretty plausible reasons why this sort of silly conclusion is wrong, and we're going to think about how we can use all of those to understand what really goes on in oligopoly. Okay, so the simplest of the responses is that firms just differ in their costs. So in this case, things are basically like a first price auction, right? Each firm tries to just beat the next firm. It doesn't want to beat it by very much because it doesn't want the price to be too low, right? So in that case, prices are not equal to the minimum, to the lowest cost of any firm in the industry. Instead, they're equal to the expectation that that firm has of the cost of the next best firm, as it tries to just be below the next best.
Is that looking ahead or is that not?
Not looking ahead. No, even if they just take as given what everyone else is doing, even if they're uncertain about other people's things, they're going to just try to beat the next guy. But if people have different costs and I don't know what someone else's cost is, I'm not just going to bid exactly my cost, right? I'm going to bid just below what the second lowest person's cost is, right? And so as we get more firms, the second lowest firm is going to get closer to the first lowest firm. Imagine that firms are just drawn from some distribution. As there get to be lots of firms, right, the second highest thing is going to get close to the first highest thing if there's some lower bound on cost. If there wasn't some lower bound on cost, that wouldn't necessarily be true, but for a lower bound on cost, that would be true. So the first and second are going to get closer and closer to one another. And so that means that as a gradual process, sort of like in the Cournot model, the price should go down towards the cost of the lowest cost firm. Right? But it's going to be a much more gradual process than in the stream case. And so that brings it closer to the sorts of ideas of the Cournot model. So one major virtue of the Cournot model is that it's super simple, and yet even in the simple version, it behaves a bit like this more complicated version of the Bertrand model. So that's one reason to favor it, is that because it leads to sort of sensible conclusions, it lets us sort of imitate this more complicated model in a simple case. And this is a broader thing, which is anytime you reach sort of an absurd conclusion from a model, your reaction should not necessarily be, oh, we've been thinking about things wrong, but rather, what's wrong with the assumptions that I made, right? Okay, so another more popular response than the one I just described is to consider models with differentiated products. So that is, in the Bertrand Edgeworth model, right, if we're selling the exact same product and I undercut you by a tiny bit, I steal all the demand from you. But if you go to any company in the world and you ask them, if you lower your price by a little bit, will you get discontinuously more sales? They would say, almost certainly not, right? Because there's lots of things that cause people to not be able to find the products or to view the products differently or be loyal to one firm or whatever, right? And that we summarize all those things as saying consumers view the products as being differentiated. And this can be because they differ in some non-price characteristics, as we discussed last week. Or they can be identical, but consumers may have to look for the products, and so may not be completely aware of the change in price. Okay, so in either case, we can write the demand that firm I faces as a function of the prices of all the firms in the market, P1 through Pn. Right? So Qi is the demand for firm I's product. And as long as this is a nice, smooth function, there's not going to be any sort of Bertrand-style discontinuity. Right? So if someone else increases their price, that might raise my demand by quite a bit, but it's not going to cause it to jump to infinity or something like that. This sort of reflects a general principle in economics, which is the epigraph of Marshall's Principles of Economics, which was one of the first really influential economics textbooks, which is natura non facet saltum. Nature doesn't make jumps. So anytime you see some weird extreme thing going on, it's probably because the model's missing something to make it smooth again. And that's what we just did. Okay. So each firm is a monopolist on its own product, but the other products are substitutes for the product. What does it mean for another product to be substitutes? Well, if the other firm increases its price, that is going to increase my quantity. Okay? This is a very broad model, and we could either think of firms as choosing their quantities and then the prices being set by some sort of market equilibrium, or think of the firms as choosing their prices and have the quantity set by market equilibrium. However, the sort of central approach that's most often used is what's called Nash prices, or Bertrand, which is an equilibrium of this where everyone takes the other firm's prices as given. And so this model is called differentiated products, Nash prices. Okay. So the same basic principles are going to apply for pricing in this case that we use to think about monopoly. So we can define the residual elasticity of a firm's demand. So that's the elasticity of demand holding fixed the prices of the other firms. So that's partial QI, partial PI, holding fixed all the other prices, times PI over QI. And then firms are going to price according to the Lerner rule. Price minus marginal cost over price is equal to 1 over the residual elasticity of demand. So this is what we sort of said in the monopoly lecture. Monopoly is not just, all the monopoly stuff is not just applicable when the firm is literally the only firm, but when any time the firm faces some residual demand. And notice that there's really nothing special about strategies as prices. We could just as easily think of the firm as choosing its quantity here. Right? The key point is that it's holding fixed, when it does that, the prices of all the other firms. Not that it chooses its price versus choosing its quantity. We could also do this Nash in quantities. But then what we'd have to do is not do this holding fixed every other firm's price, but holding fixed every other firm's quantity, and that would require doing some complicated matrix inversion of these derivatives. Okay. But the ideas would be very similar. So there's no reason that differentiated products requires prices to be the firm's strategies. It's just that it turns out, for various historical reasons, that this is used very broadly in industrial economics. Okay. So, oligopolists create externalities on one another. And Jason's not here, is he? So under Cournot, these externalities between the oligopolists are purely pecuniary. And Michael, could you explain why under Cournot the externalities are purely pecuniary? Well, so all the firms take as given the other firm's quantities, right? So what is the only way they could affect the other firms? Exactly. And we know that a change in any externality that's mediated through prices is a purely pecuniary externality, right? So from the perspective of every firm, if it changes its quantity, the only effect that has is on the prices of the other firms, not on how much they produce, right? So it believes, yeah. On the other hand, under differentiated products, Nash and prices, Sharda, why is there a real externality? Don't look at the slide.
Okay. So under Nash and quantities, there's a real externality.
Under Nash and prices, when I take as given the prices of the other firm, why is there a real externality?
Oh, because if you take the prices as given, there's change in quantity.
Yeah. Exactly. In fact, there's no pecuniary externality. It's all real externality, right? Because I'm taking as given the prices of the other firms, right? So anything that the other firms lose is lost to society. It's not just gained by the consumers, right? The consumers, in fact, only gain directly from my reduction in my price. They don't gain anything from the change in my other firms' prices. Under Cournot, too low, sorry. Quantities will always be too low under Cournot, but Terence, is it necessarily the case that firms' quantities will be too low under differentiated products, Nash and prices?
I don't think so, because they can change the quantities to match what the demand is.
Well, how does it relate to our analysis of externalities, right? We know that they bring an externality that's equal to the markup to the consumers, And under Cournot, they don't bring any real externalities to the other firms, so there's nothing to offset that. But how about under differentiated products, Nash and prices? Well, so they earn a negative. They create a negative externality on other firms when they lower their price, right? They create a positive externality for consumers, but they create a negative externality for other firms, right? And when they create a negative externality for firms, that may offset or more than offset the positive externality they bring to consumers. And so under differentiated products, Nash and prices, they may actually produce too much, at least in principle, if the other firms have large markups relative to their markup, and they take a lot of business away from them by lowering their prices, that may cause more harm to the other firms than it causes to consumers. So a simple example of that is, imagine that there's a firm, it's earning giant monopoly profits on some product, and then someone comes in, offers a really crappy product at a really low price. Everyone would be sort of better off if everyone was buying the good product, even though they were paying a high price for it. But now this other firm comes in and undercuts it. Everyone switches to buying the crappy product. The other firm loses its profits, and this firm gains. But clearly everyone overall is worse off, right? The other firm loses more profits than the consumers gain. Yeah, but
is it a good example of that? Maybe like the fast food industry, because it's better for everyone not to eat McDonald's and pay for McDonald's, but then because of McDonald's is so cheap, everyone goes to McDonald's.
well, you'd have to think who was the monopolist that they came in to compete with, because this effect only occurred. Your reasoning is a little bit more paternalistic. It's like consumers aren't acting in their best interest. But I think a better example would be like rip-off versions of various things like the iPod or whatever, right? If they're totally crappy, you create a rip-off version. Maybe everyone starts buying the rip-off version, but that takes away lots of profits from Apple, but it doesn't really do any benefit, to society overall.
But
right?
does it? I don't see how that's taking away from society at all.
Yeah.
Because people are valuing the zoo.
Yeah.
But the restaurant at the price they're paying for, right?
Well,
so are you saying they don't know the price?
No, imagine that everyone was going to buy either an iPod or this crappy knockoff, regardless, right? In that case, and imagine the crappy knockoff, everyone values less than they value the iPod, right? And imagine that Apple can't lower its price to compete with the new guy who comes in for some reason. Then what's going to happen is that everyone's going to move from buying the good product to buying the crappy product.
Why would they move necessarily?
Because the price is lower.
But they're not. But if they value the iPod higher, then they're gonna.
Well, but not if the price of this is lower. The point is they're not fully capturing. If the price.
You have to do a utility. You have to see the utility function.
Well, imagine that everyone values the iPod at $400, but it's priced at $500.
Oh.
And they value the other one at $350, but it's priced at $350.
Okay. I see.
Right? Sorry, it's priced at you sort of see what I'm doing.
Yeah.
You can get because they're not internalizing the profits that are brought to the firm. You see what I mean? They're not. Everyone values the iPod at $2,000, right? And it's priced at $500. And they value the other thing at $1,900, but it's priced at $100, right? And then everyone's going to switch to the crappy one, even though the total amount of value to society is greater if they all buy the iPod, right? Because they don't internalize the profits that are being made by Apple. And that can only happen in something like Nash and prices competition. Yeah.
So basically, if there's two products, then neither one gives the consumers any surplus, but Apple is making profits, but the other guy's not. Society as a whole is actually better off if Apple makes it.
Exactly.
I have a question.
Yeah.
With DNPI, does that mean that they can have the same price? What happens when they have the same price?
Sure, they can have the same price.
Like soda, for instance, all soda have the same cost, but it's two different things.
Yeah, and then it's just some people buy one, some people buy the other. And if any firm lowered its price, it would get a few more consumers, but it wouldn't get a ton more. Yeah. That's just called symmetric differentiation. So when I talk about symmetric differentiated Nash prices equilibrium, that is exactly what you just described. It's like there's a bunch of different stuff, people view it differently, but they all end up charging the same price because it's sort of different, but sort of all different in the same way. You know what I mean? So that's exactly what symmetrically differentiated Nash prices equilibrium is.
Can you possibly,
Yeah.
I'm still confused, but can you possibly draw the two research surpluses? Is that possible?
Yeah, sure.
Like what you're describing with the iPod versus the other?
Yeah. So
Because I just don't.
yeah. So imagine that people value the iPod at $2,000, and they value the other thing at $1,900, right? But the price for the iPod is $500, and this other guy comes in and offers this thing for $100. Now, clearly, everyone's going to buy this, right? Because they get $1,800 of surplus by buying that. They're not going to buy the iPod, but they only get $1,500 of surplus by buying that. And imagine the cost of producing both of these things is zero, right? Then clearly it would be better if everyone bought the iPod than everyone buying this, because the total amount of value is higher here, right? So by coming in and offering the product for a lower price, if Apple can't lower its price, the total value to society is reduced. That would never happen with Cournot because the quantity of iPods sold would stay fixed. Okay. Okay, so in fact, I want to define the term competing or competition to just mean that two firms' products are substitutes for one another. So all that it means that I compete with you is that if I lower my price, that leads to less demand for you. So if firms act to internalize the externalities, pecuniary or otherwise, that they cause to each other, what do we say that the firms are doing, Alex? Don't look at the slide.
I'm sorry. If they act to internalize the externality.
So if I increase my quantity or reduce my price, I hurt you. What do you say that firms do if they act in such a way as to avoid hurting each other in that way?
Well, what did you call it? I don't want to say like a cartel.
Yeah, it's collusion. Yeah, collusion or a cartel. That's exactly right. So this is my favorite phrase for it is actually a combination in the restraint of trade. This is what U.S. law refers to it as. So the Sherman Antitrust Act outlaws combinations in the restraint of trade. So this has been denounced ever since Adam Smith and is illegal under the Sherman Antitrust Act. And here is a very famous cartoon that helped stimulate that act. So there were these groups of cartels sort of taking over. They had a lot of political power, as you will explore in your next problem set. They also had a lot of economic power, and so they were portrayed as this giant octopus, and this was an example of a progressive cartoon that helped stimulate the passage of the Sherman Antitrust Act in the late 19th century. So once upon a time, before the Sherman Antitrust Act, it was legal to form a cartel, and in fact, you could even enforce an agreement made among the parties that they wouldn't lower their prices. And in fact, this was true in continental Europe up until the 80s when the Maastricht reforms were put into place. And effectively, it's still legal in many countries. So for example, in Peru, there's essentially no effective restraints against forming a cartel. And Britain actually made cartel, was the first country to make cartels illegal back in the 18th century. But nowadays, the U.S. is now probably the world leader in enforcement against cartels. Something like 1,000 businesses have people get fined or have people that go to jail every year for collusive activities. So things that are illegal include explicit agreements about the prices that firms will charge or the services that they will offer. So Adam Smith has a famous quote that anytime you see members of the same profession getting together to talk about anything socially, it's almost always an indicator that they're engaging in a conspiracy against the public interest. So this makes meetings and communication like this illegal. This is only true if firms are competitors. We'll see in the lecture after Thanksgiving that if the firm's products are complementary with one another, a situation that we'll call collaboration, these things are often permitted. Even without explicit communication, you can even go to jail for tacitly agreeing with other firms to collude. And your problem set will ask you to explore that in the context of auctions. This is prosecuted much less often because it's harder to prove. But if you do get caught for either of these things, you can go to jail, and people have for many years, and you can get large civil penalties. In particular, you can actually be forced to pay 3 times the harm that was caused by your activity, because the idea is that there's only about a 1/3 chance you get caught, and so they want to multiply it up so that the expected penalty you face is equal to the harms created. So there's many practical challenges today in running a cartel, and this makes collusion difficult and only possible in some very limited settings. Okay, so the basic problem is that the basic problem that people face in trying to form and maintain a cartel is that a cartel is going to benefit all of the members of the cartel, but each firm is going to have an incentive individually to betray the cartel. And Anthony, why do firms have an incentive to betray the cartel?
Because it's not Nash Equilibrium. Any firm, like, by lowering the price of anything can get not the whole market, it's
Yeah.
a significant profit.
Yeah. The whole idea is that the firm is internalizing an externality. And what it means something's an externality is that it's not in your interest to look out for it, right? So anything that internalizes an externality, unless it has some way to force you to do that, is not going to be very effective, right? And so by reducing the price or increasing the quantity, each firm can individually benefit by stealing business from other firms, right? And so the more ambitious a cartel is, the less stable it's going to be. That is, the higher prices it tries to sustain, the more incentive there's going to be to defect. And Luke, why is that the case?
Sorry, could you repeat it?
So the higher prices, the lower quantities, the closer to monopoly a cartel tries to get, the more incentives it's going to give its members to defect or to cheat on the cartel. Why is that?
It's because like with game theory, you have to be concerned with like what your opponents are doing.
Yeah.
So then, if one firm is showing that they're going to defect, then all other firms want to beat them to the process so that they can capture the market share before that one firm that is defecting is going to capture like a larger share.
Not sure, but do you want to elaborate? Yeah.
For like more ambitious cartel, like the price is often more expensive. And
Yeah.
then, like for example, like if I'm in a cartel like selling like cans of Coke, then selling one more can of Coke by cheating the cartel would not bring that much benefit. But then if I'm like a oil seller, selling one more gallon of oil would bring super benefit to me. So there's more incentive to cheat. So
Yeah, exactly. So if the prices are high, then by undercutting by a little bit, I get a lot more benefit than if the prices are low, right? And so there's going to be more incentive to try to steal sales the higher prices are. Near the competitive level, there's going to be essentially no incentive to cheat, right? Because I'm just doing what I would be doing anyways, right? So the extent of collusion which is possible is exactly related to the extent to which it's possible to deter cheating. It's sort of like, we are able to sustain a level of taxes on illegal, products like drugs, which is just high enough so that it doesn't create a black market, right? So it's similarly, you can sustain an amount of collusion which is just equal to your ability to deter cheating, right? So every cartel is going to need to create expectations that people who defect from the cartel will be punished either socially or economically. And we won't really talk about some of the social aspects, but you could create, if you manage to create sort of a feeling of camaraderie among people in the industry, or a feeling of sympathy for each other, that can sustain a cartel as well. We're going to talk more today about economic ways, but we can, any of the other incentive ideas we talked about earlier in the course can be relevant as well. So a goal of a cartel is to ensure that there's credible punishment of cheaters. On the other hand, the goal of the government agency or customers is to catch the cartel and prevent them from accomplishing this goal, right? And so Stigler's theory of oligopoly is exactly based on this back and forth. It's based on this interaction between the government and consumers trying to catch the cartel, and the cartel trying to catch the people within it who are going to defect, right? And this is true of a lot of illegal organizations, right? The mafias try to, stop people from screwing them, and the government tries to stop the mafia from stopping people from screwing them, right? So in order for the cartel to deter cheating, what is it going to have to do, Mike? In order to credibly be able to punish people, what are sort of the steps that the cartel's going to have to go through, as anyone who wants to deter someone from cheating would have to do?
You have to offer them, it could offer them like an economic reason not to, offer them a better.
That's right, but what in order for you to feel like you're going to get caught, what has to be the case?
That I could get caught, there's a high probability.
Yes, there has to be detection, and then punishment if it's detected, right? So that's really the key, is you need to be able to catch people who are cheating on the cartel, and then you have to be able to punish them for cheating on the cartel, right? And you also have to be able to figure out what's the right agreement for us to make, given our ability to detect, right? So this is a big problem. Even determining the right cartel agreement for us to make is difficult because the information is diffuse, just as with any other externality problem. Because all the cartel is doing is solving externalities among the members, right? And it has to figure out what those externalities are in order to solve the problem. And because people can't get together in a room and all confer about this, and because the government's breathing down their neck, right, that's going to make it tougher for them to even figure out what the right agreement is, right? They also have, Fed.
What would be optimal strategy for a cartel? Would it form like a sub-cartel with like 90% of the people that were there before, and that way they can get punished?
Well, so that's going to be another potential problem that a cartel can run into, is that subgroups of the cartel might go and screw the rest of the cartel, or individuals might go and screw. So there's a lot of different things that can go on. So all the issues we're going to talk about show up in every game theory situation that there is. But yes, that's a general type of a problem. And there's a big literature on that. In fact, there's some people here who are experts in those types of issues. So they also have to be clear about what is cheating and what's sort of like, well, we're not so happy about that, but that's okay. Because you have to have clear rules if you're going to enforce them, right? Firms have to be given flexibility to change their production and so forth. I mean, if a giant hurricane hits a plant, or if suddenly they discover a giant gold mine, they have to be able to take advantage of that to some extent. But on the other hand, you don't want to allow people to cheat, because if there's too much flexibility, well, then people can get away with destroying the cartel, right? And you have to be able to detect cheating. You have to distinguish it from the background noise, right? All the other things that are going on. Because there's some things that may look like cheating but actually be innocent, or other things that may look innocent but actually be cheating, right? You also have to have a cheap way to punish, right? If it's super expensive for you to punish, no one's going to believe you'll actually punish, right? Yeah, Edward.
I'm kind of thinking of like OPEC right now. Like, how exactly do they like punish people that don't like work with them?
Well, they have
Or-
they can have a price war. They can ship a lot of oil to that person's region so as to flood their particular market. They can build pipelines into that person's region for gas and sort of flood them with gas. Those are the types of things that they could do. Yeah, but that's a very good question. So the ideal thing would be if you could just tax the people who cheat and redistribute to other people. That would be the ideal way to do it. And one way to do that is by shifting market shares. So you could say, if you cheat today, well then in the future you're going to get less of the allocation of the production for the cartel, right? Because that is more of a transfer between the members rather than just destructive. But often that doesn't, you can't really coordinate that because that's so complicated to figure that all out. So often what happens is there's just a price war. And that's really inefficient because from the firm's perspective, right, because they're going to just destroy everybody's profits. But that may be the only way of deterring someone else is to threaten to have a price war. And you have to be able to punish the people quickly, right? Because if you don't punish them quickly, they're like, okay, well, eventually they'll catch me, but who cares? I will have made a bunch of money by then, right? So the more patient, the more long-term oriented, the more patient people are, and the more frequently they interact, the easier it's going to be to deter collusion. Stigler also emphasizes some other factors, and Bill is not here. Does anyone remember some of the factors that Stigler emphasized in his article? Yeah, Terrence.
I think you said if they transact more often and they cheat, it's more likely to get caught.
Mm-hmm. That's right. So that's what we just said on the slide. But does anyone remember anything additional that Stigler added? Okay. So he emphasized that if there are large and heterogeneous buyers, that's going to make it very hard to collude. Why? Because everyone's going to want to get those big buyers, right? And so they're going to all have an incentive to offer like a secret discount for that one big buyer. And so it's going to be very hard for them to like divide up the market in some fair way among the firms. And that's going to make it hard to sustain collusion. Plus, the big buyer will have an interest in breaking up collusion. So if he thinks it's going on, he'll go to one of the firms and he says, look, go and screw the rest of the people. I'm going to give you a great deal. Right? You can have all my business if you just break up this cartel. Right? Similarly, heterogeneity of products or firms hurts because it makes it very hard to figure out what the optimum is. If all the firms are doing totally different things, it's like comparing apples and oranges, right? It's like, what exactly would be fair? What should we do? It's hard for me to compare. I know my situation, but I don't know what your situation is. That can make things very difficult to even find an agreement. Price transparency helps deter defection. So if every time you lower your price, I know that you lowered your price, then it's really easy for me to punish you. But if you can lower your price secretly, then it becomes very easy to undermine the cartel. Because all I find out is that I'm losing some sales, but I don't know whether that's just because of the demand fluctuations or whether that's because of you cheating, right? Industry concentration also helps maintain a cartel. So if there's like 100 different firms, you need to make sure that no individual firm like accidentally cheats, and it's very hard to keep track of everyone, and there might be one person who's tempted to cheat, and if there's only a small number of people, it's much easier to keep track of everything, and there's many fewer people who will be tempted to cheat, and we'll talk in a week and a half about why large numbers of people in general make it difficult to cooperate. But it's sort of intuitive that there's a large number of people, it's going to be harder to get them all to make this sort of agreement, especially without explicit communication. Greater variability of demand patterns is going to make it hard to monitor. So if this industry is very cyclical, or if demand fluctuates in ways that are hard to predict, especially across firms, that's going to make it really hard to know whether one firm was cheating or whether it was just noise in the market. The more frequently people interact, the quicker one can detect the cheating. If there's growing demand in the industry, it's going to be much easier to collude than if there's shrinking demand. So if there's growing demand, what that means is that everyone says, okay, I want to make sure that I make a lot of profits in the future. I don't care very much about what's going on today, right? And that's going to make them more stick to the cartel because they want to make profits later. Whereas if the demand is declining, right, if the industry is going out of business, you want to make everything you can while the going is still good, right? Okay, so all of these are going to determine the extent to which firms expect that if they lower their prices, the other firms will lower their prices as well, and that will, lead to a price war that they don't want to avoid, right? And a simple way to sum this all up mathematically, I mean, there's a bunch of different factors going on, but a simple way to sum that into a single number, like in this course, these elasticities, right? That all this complicated stuff comes down to some elasticity, is the idea of a firm's conjecture. What a conjecture is if I lower my price, how much will my rival lower or raise her price? And this could also work with quantities. If I increase my quantity, how much do I expect other people to increase their quantities in response to that, right? And these expectations of conjectures vary depending on Stigler's factors, right? If I think that someone else is going to perceive my decrease in price, well, then I'm going to expect that they'll decrease their prices more quickly or by more, right? And if we just want to put that into a simple model, we just say they'll lower their prices more, right? That captures the fact that they lower more quickly, more reliably, et cetera, et cetera. And so a model incorporating these is called a conjectural variations model. And basically what it does is it just collapses all of these Stigler factors down to one parameter called the conjectural parameter, right? And the reason that this is useful is it lets us combine all those Stigler ideas that we were just talking about collusion, with just the simple models of differentiated product Nash and prices. Not simple. The mathematical models of differentiated products Nash and prices or Cournot composition, right? And in the Cournot model, and the interesting thing is we can actually think of the Cournot model as just being a model where people take prices as given, but I expect that if I decrease my price, the other person will also decrease their price, right? So that sort of was David's idea earlier, right? If when I lower my price, expect other people to also lower their price, it's going to behave a lot more like the Cournot model. On the other hand, one where we take our prices as given is just like a Cournot model, but I expect that when I increase my quantity, the other person will increase their quantity, right? When I increase my quantity, that the other person will decrease their quantity, right? Because if I'm holding their price fixed, that means when I increase my quantity, lower my price, that means that they're going to sell less, decrease their quantity, right? So conjectural variations can be seen as a broad framework which puts together all of these different models and just thinks that, well, look, I'm going to choose something, and then I'm going to think about how other people will react to that. Rather than holding fixed what other people do, what they do might change when I change what I do. And the thing that's useful about this is it lets us sort of have a broad framework in which we can talk about all these things and reduce it to a single parameter. Okay. So let's consider the basic Cournot model, and now let's put in conjectures into that, right? So again, the Cournot model was this, right? Price depends on my quantity and the quantities of all the other firms times quantity. Okay, but now we're going to add an extra element, which is that I'm going to think, hey, if I increase my quantity, that will change the quantities produced by all the other firms. If I do that, John, what is my optimal pricing formula going to be? If now, when I increase my quantity, that leads to a change in the other firm's quantities as well as my own. So just take the derivative of my profits with respect to my quantity, now taking into account the fact that I'm going to see the other firm's quantities changing when I change my quantity by this much.
So derivative of the first. So P prime of Q plus
Yeah.
P.
Plus what?
P.
That's P minus C, right? But then there's also going to, it's not just going to be P prime times Q, it's going to be P prime. How much does the total quantity change when I change my quantity? It increases by 1, but it also increases by how much other people's quantity increases when my quantity increases, right?
So 1 plus that.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So it's going to be 1 plus that thing there. So it's going to be P plus P prime times Q, I, times 1 plus D, how much other people's quantity changes when my quantity changes, is equal to C. Right? So if other people are going to increase their quantity when I increase my quantity, then that's going to cause marginal revenue to be even lower than price. If other people, when I increase my quantity, respond aggressively to that and increase their quantity, right, then that's going to lead marginal revenue to be below price, further below price. It's going to magnify this. And that's what you'd expect in a cartel, right? If I increase my quantity, other people retaliate by increasing their quantities, right? This is called a conjectured accommodating reaction. Why is it called accommodating? Because if I reduce my quantity and I'm nice, other people are nice back to me, right? By reducing their quantity. Okay. And this is how we facilitate collusion. On the other hand, if when I increase quantity, they reduce quantity, that is, if I decrease quantity, they sort of step into the gap and fill that gap, right? That's called an aggressive reaction. And in fact, in the extreme, if this were equal to -1, this would be exactly the Bertrand model, because if every time I decrease my quantity, other people step in to fill the gap, right? That's exactly their price. The price is going to stay fixed, right? So this was actually on your exam, this exact model, right? I asked you to think about, in the later parts, if I increase my quantity and I expect that that will change how much other people are producing, how do I behave? Right? Okay. So, we can also stick these conjectures into a model of differentiated products, Nash and pricing. But I'm not going to talk about that. Okay. So a natural question is how much Sticklers factors impact the extent to which I think other firms will retaliate if I increase my quantity, right? We know we identified a bunch of factors that intuitively seem like they would increase the extent to which I'd expect that, but we haven't thought about how much that would happen. And that's really sort of an empirical question. This parameter is in different markets, and then try to relate that to the extent to which prices are transparent, people interact frequently, etc. Right? And this will help us to determine the impact that these factors have on the amount of collusion that's going on. In some sense, we can measure the amount of collusion by the value of this parameter in different markets. Right? That's sort of a very natural notion of how much collusion is going on. And so a natural approach is to regress this conjectural variations parameter on a bunch of the factors that we were talking about. We can try to measure those in different industries and run a regression. Amazingly, no one has actually done this as far as I know. No one's actually attempted to undertake this exercise, but it's sort of the most natural thing that one would do to try to figure out how much these different Stickler factors matter. The one reason no one has done this is that we have to measure this conjectural variations parameter in a bunch of different industries, and this is a bit difficult, but there's two approaches people have taken to measuring the conjectural variations parameter. The first is to try to measure the cost and measure the slope of the demand, and then just to solve out for the conjectural variations parameter. Right? Another approach, however, this was sort of the traditional approach. This came under criticism during the 1980s because people said that it's hard to get data on firms' costs a lot of the time. And so another approach you can take is by looking at two different demand curves, looking at shifts in demand curves that don't just change the level of demand, but change its slope. Because the extent to which the price is affected by the slope of demand determines the extent to which firms are sort of acting with market power, right? So to see that, imagine that initially we have this demand D2 here. And then we switch to this demand D3, right? Well, that's going to cause, in a competitive market, that's not going to change prices at all, right? But in a monopolistic market, that would cause firms to lower their prices by a lot because it's going to cause the marginal revenue curve to move by a bunch, right? And that, depending on whether the industry is acting pretty close to a monopolist or pretty close to competitive, could have a very small or a very large effect. So if we can find cases where the demand curve, rather than shifting, just rotates, we can use that to measure the extent to which the industry is working like a monopolist or like a competitive industry, and that'll measure the conjectural variations parameter. But conjectural variations can be used not just to summarize sort of explicit collusion, but just what you might think of as sort of natural strategic effects. So if when other firms increase their quantity, that's basically like this exogenous quantity increase that we talked about in the monopoly lecture, right? And that is going to lead me to want to increase the total amount supplied to the market by rho Q, right? That's what we talked about, the quantity pass-through, right? And this is going to require me to reduce the amount that I produce, or increase it, depending on whether this is greater than or equal to 0, greater than or less than 0, by 1 minus the quantity pass-through, which is the same as 1 minus the pass-through, right? So we can say that the other firm's quantity is a strategic substitute for my quantity. That is, when another firm increases their quantity, I want to reduce mine if the pass-through rate is less than 1. And it's a strategic complement if it's greater than 1. And when other firms change their prices, if another firm, say, reduces its price, that's going to shift the demand for my product, right? If they reduce their price, the demand for my product will increase, right? And that will lead me to move my price by 1 minus my pass-through rate, right? That's, again, what we talked about in that lecture, the sum of how much I move my price in response to a change in cost and a increase in demand is equal to 1. So price will be a strategic complement if the pass-through is less than 1, and a strategic substitute if the pass-through is greater than 1. So firms may, to some extent at least, anticipate that when they change their price or their quantity, other firms will just naturally have this strategic reaction. And that gets back to the model that, was it, Mike, were you the one in the beginning who was talking about the Stackelberg model? So almost every company, even if they don't think of themselves as colluding, is going to think, if I change my price, what is my competitor going to do? Partly just from strategic reasons, partly because he's trying to punish me. There's lots of different reasons why my competitor could react. And the nice thing about the conjectural variations thing is it takes into account both firms sort of trying to punish each other or being collusive, but also just taking their natural strategic reactions. And all of these are going to affect the degree of performance of a market. So let's consider the model that Mike was talking about. Just when firms take into account this sort of natural reaction, how is that going to affect what they're going to do in the market, right? So the simplest version is sort of a duopoly where one firm chooses its quantity, and then the other firm takes as given that quantity and chooses their quantity. So this is called Stackelberg leadership. So the profits of the second firm, right, the one that is the follower, that just takes as given the first firm's quantity, are going to be the amount they produce times price, which depends on the two quantities, minus cost, which is the same as they're going to choose the total quantity minus the quantity produced by the other firm, times price, which depends on the total quantity minus cost. Right? So this is exactly the same as that Q tilde we talked about from before, right? This is just, there's exogenously someone else producing this quantity Q1. And so we know that the amount that I will increase the total quantity when the Q1 increases by a little bit is equal to rho, right? Okay. So now, the first firm needs to make its decision, right? It's going to choose how much of quantity to produce, given that the total quantity will be determined by the second firm, according to this relationship here, that the total quantity increases in response to an increase in the initial quantity by the pass-through rate, right? And what, Matt, is going to be their optimal quantity in this case? Right, they're going to maximize their profits here, knowing that the rate at which the total quantity increases when they increase their quantity is the pass-through rate. You can come do it on the board if you want to. Or...
So, next I take the derivative. So
Yeah.
So P and then times the pass-through.
Yeah.
Plus P prime times quantity.
Yeah. Q1 times P prime times the pass-through rate, right?
Right.
Plus
Plus Q1 times, now do P prime, I'm forgetting what I did for this first.
so you did this part, you did the P prime times this. You took the derivative of the second part, now you just have to take the derivative of
Okay.
Q1.
And it's, can't think of it.
It's just one,
Oh.
right? Times
Right,
the
right.
second path, right? It's
Right.
just the product rule, right? Yeah, but that's right. So, yeah, so they just set P plus P prime times Q1 times rho equal to C. And then we can then analyze whether this makes the market more or less competitive, right? So, for example, does the leader benefit from being the leader, right? Well, clearly they have to be, because they could always set their quantity equal to what they said in Cournot their quantity equal to. So they have to be better off than that, because they know that the other firm will just react as they would to the Cournot quantity, right? Okay. Does the follower benefit from the firm being the leader? Well, that depends on whether it leads the leader to increase or decrease their quantity. The follower always wants the leader to decrease their quantity, right? Because that's better for the follower. They have less to compete with, right? And that's going to depend on whether the leader expects the follower to increase in response to an increase in quantity or decrease in response to an increase in quantity. If the leader expects that the follower will decrease, that is, if its strategic complements and pass-through is greater than 1, then that's going to lead to an increase in the markup, and that will be better for the follower firm. Right? And in what case is it better to be the follower than to be the leader? Well, exactly if the pass-through is greater than 1 as well, right? Because if you're the follower, you're going to produce, the leader is going to have to reduce his quantity, and that's going to benefit you more because you can sort of fill the gap for him. And is society better off from the firm being a leader, or would it be better off if there was just Cournot competition? Well, it all depends on, again, the pass-through rate compared to 1, because if that's greater than 1, right, then that's going to mean that this term, which is the difference between the price and the marginal revenue, that's the monopoly problem, right, is going to be greater. If the pass-through is less than 1, then this is going to be smaller than what it would be. Okay. So I think that this suggests a pretty natural alternative way that we can think about conjectures, about how to measure them. Which is that, if you think, how does a firm form its conjectures about, how other firms will respond to what it does? Well, it probably looks at other times in the past where its costs went up and therefore it raised its prices, right? And it uses that as a way to figure out what will happen if it raises its prices now, right? So why don't we as economists do the exact same thing, right? Look at cases in the past where this firm raised its prices and see what other firms did, because that's probably how the firm is figuring it out anyway, right? And this hypothesis is called consistent conjectures. If a firm conjectures that the other firms will respond in the way that in the past, when the costs rose, and the firm increased its prices, that led other firms to change their prices, then the firm is said to have consistent conjectures. And this is due to work in 1981 by Tim Bresnahan. If you think about it, the other models are actually a little bit strange. So in the Cournot model, I know that if I increase my quantity, the firm might say decrease their quantity. And yet, I assume that they're holding it fixed. That's a little bit weird, right? So this is also very convenient from an empirical perspective, because it means that if we observe things that change the firm's cost, we can actually measure the conjectures. And that's the same things that will allow us to measure demand, which we need for other reasons as well. Anyway, so anyone who wants to go can go, but I'll just finish up by explaining this as you leave. So this lets us isolate. It's a bit like the monopoly model. Consistent conjectures lets us isolate the relevant part of the market we care about. So if we're looking at a single firm, we're only interested in their behavior. If we have a shock to the cost of that firm, we can estimate their residual demand curve by just seeing, given what all the other firms do, what ends up happening to that firm's prices. That's what the firm's going to care about, because that's what will happen if it raises its prices. prices, right?
Yeah. You can get both.
And this was a strategy used by Baker and Bresnahan in 1988. They applied it to the brewing industry using changes in transportation costs for individual firms because of like changes in roads and stuff. When we talk next class about the merger between two firms, the key thing is going to be that if we just have changes in the cost of those two firms, that'll allow us to measure everything that we care about for those two firms. Because, yeah, all sorts of other things will move around, but that's what those two firms are going to take into account, right? Because they're going to think about when a change in their cost happened, how did that lead all the prices to change? And it allows you to separate them from all the other firms in the industry, which makes things a bit simpler. And you can apply this more broadly. You can apply it to thinking about quality. How do the other firms change the quality of their products when I change my price or my quality? And thinking about lots of other things like antitrust. This approach, which I think makes a lot of sense, got historically lost in the oligopoly literature, but I think it is a pretty interesting and a great opportunity for senior thesis to do more thinking about this. So, thanks. Yeah, again, turn in your problem sets. If anyone who is doing well in the class would like to be a TA again, RA, let me know. I'll try